The morning Rose Norris drove her first stake into the dry earth at the edge of Abel Underwood's property, she told herself it was an accident, that she had simply miscounted the paces, that the sun was in her eyes, that the fence line was harder to see than she had expected, and she almost believed it. It was the spring of 1882, in the sun-scorched valley outside of Abilene, Kansas, where the wind came down off the plains like a living thing, and the grass turned gold before June had even had the chance to settle in. The town itself was quieter than it used to be, since the cattle drives had moved further west, but there was still enough life in it to matter: a general store run by a man named Grover Phelps, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on Wednesdays, a livery stable, a saloon that Rose had never set foot inside, and a post office where she collected the letters from her sister in St. Louis that always arrived slightly crumpled and smelling faintly of lavender. Rose had come to Abilene 14 months earlier, in February of 1881, with a small trunk of belongings, a leather-bound journal, a pouch of seed packets she had brought all the way from Missouri, and a deed to a narrow parcel of land that had belonged to her late uncle, Gerald Norris, who had died without a wife and without children, and had seen fit to leave the property to his only niece. It was not much: a house that needed its porch boards replaced, a well that worked only when the weather cooperated, and 22 acres of land that butted up against the larger and more prosperous Underwood Ranch on its eastern side. She was 26 years old when she arrived, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat and green eyes that missed very little. She had come from a background of school teaching in a small Missouri town, and she carried that quiet precision with her, the way she measured things, the way she noticed the slant of afternoon light, the way she listened before she spoke. She had not come to Abilene looking for a husband. She had come because the land was hers, and because she had wanted, for the first time in her life, to belong somewhere in a way that no landlord or employer could take away. Abel Underwood was 31 when she arrived, and he had not been looking for anything either. He was the kind of man that the land had shaped slowly and without apology, broad-shouldered from years of fence mending and cattle driving, with dark hair that always needed cutting and a jaw that always needed shaving, and eyes the color of worn denim that had a habit of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. He had inherited the Underwood Ranch from his father, Thomas Underwood, who had died of a fever 3 years prior, and Abel had been running it alone ever since with the help of 2 ranch hands named Clem Haverford and a younger man everyone called Dooley, whose real name was Peter Doolan, but who had gone by Dooley since he was 12 years old and saw no reason to change. Abel was not an unfriendly man, but he was not an easy one either. He spoke when he had something to say and went quiet when he did not, and the townspeople of Abilene had long since stopped trying to draw him into conversations he had no interest in. He paid his debts on time, kept his fences repaired, brought his cattle to market without incident, attended church on Sundays with the same careful reliability with which he did everything else, and had exactly no interest in the various social arrangements that the women of the church auxiliary had been gently suggesting for the past 2 years. He and Rose had met on her 3rd day in Abilene, when she had come to introduce herself as his new neighbor, and had found him crouched beside a section of split-rail fence on the western edge of his property, replacing a post that had rotted through. He had looked up at her with those still, denim-colored eyes, and she had held out her hand the way she had seen her father do when meeting someone for the first time, and he had stood up and shaken it with a grip that was firm but careful. "Rose Norris," she had said, "I've taken over my uncle's property, the old Gerald Norris place." "I know it," he had said. "Abel Underwood, your uncle was a decent man." "He was," she had agreed, and that had been the entirety of their first conversation. He had gone back to his fence post, and she had walked back to her narrow house, and that had been that, for several months more or less. They had seen each other in town, of course, at Phelps's store, at church, at the occasional town gathering. They were civil in the way that neighbors with a shared fence line are civil when they have no particular reason to be otherwise. He had helped her in October of 1881, when a windstorm had knocked a section of her roof loose, coming over without being asked, and spending the better part of a Saturday afternoon replacing the damaged boards while she handed him nails and tried not to think about how strange it was to have a man on her roof at all. She had thanked him properly and offered him supper, and he had declined with a brief nod that she had not known how to interpret, and he had ridden back to his ranch as the sun went down. She thought about him more than she should have, and she knew it, and she had enough honesty in her character to acknowledge it to herself even if she would never have admitted it to anyone else. There was something about the quiet solidity of him that she found herself measuring other things against, the way a person finds a fixed point on the horizon and uses it to walk straight without thinking about it. The garden was not an accident. Rose had never been particularly good at accidents. She had been planning it since February of 1882, when the seed catalogs had arrived at the post office, and she had spent 3 winter evenings at her kitchen table with a lamp and a ruler, drawing out a plot on paper. She wanted tomatoes and beans and squash for practical purposes, and she wanted sunflowers and wild verbena, and something climbing and sweet morning glories, maybe, or honeysuckle for purposes that were harder to explain, and that she preferred not to examine too closely. The parcel of land she had chosen for the garden was at the far eastern edge of her property, where the soil was darkest, and where a shallow seasonal creek ran close enough to the surface that the ground stayed softer longer into the dry season. It was also, by coincidence, that she was absolutely committed to calling a coincidence, directly adjacent to the path that Abel Underwood rode every morning when he made his circuit of the eastern fence line on his gray horse. She drove the first stake on a Tuesday morning in April, and she was still hammering the second one into place when she heard the steady, unhurried sound of hooves on the packed dirt path. She did not look up. She focused very intently on the stake. The hooves stopped. She could feel his eyes on the back of her hat the way you feel the sun on your neck. "Morning," he said. She looked up then because not looking up would have been too obvious. "Good morning, Mr. Underwood." He was on his gray horse, a tall, calm animal named Jasper that she had learned the name of from Dooley, who talked considerably more than Abel did. Abel was looking at the stakes and then at the ground and then at the stakes again, with that particular expression of his, that was not quite a frown, but was thinking hard about the neighborhood of one. "Your property line," he said, "is about 12 feet west of where you've put that second stake." Rose set her hammer down on the ground beside her and pushed her hat back slightly and looked at the stake with an expression of such genuine-looking puzzlement that she was privately quite impressed with herself. "Is it?" she said. "It is," he said. "Well," she said, after a pause that she calibrated very carefully, "I must have miscounted the paces. The light was strange this morning." He looked at the sky, which was perfectly clear and blue and had been since dawn. Then he looked back at her. Something moved in his expression, some very small, quiet shift, and then the corner of his mouth did something that she had never seen it do before. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was not the kind of smile that anyone who did not know his face well would have necessarily noticed. But Rose noticed it. She noticed it the way she noticed the first green shoots coming up through the dark soil in early spring, with a sudden, almost painful attention that went all the way down. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that same careful steadiness it always did, but with something warmer underneath it now, something she had not heard before. "Seeing as you've already put the stakes in, it'd be a shame to move them." He did not wait for her to respond. He clicked his tongue softly and Jasper walked on, and Rose stood in the April sunlight with her hammer at her feet and her heart doing something it had no business doing at 7:30 in the morning, and she thought, well, that was something. She built the garden. She did not move the stakes. Over the following 2 weeks, she dug and turned the soil and laid out her rows with the same methodical care she had applied to everything in her life. She planted her tomato seedlings that she had started in trays on her kitchen windowsill through the cold months. She planted bean seeds in careful lines. She put in a row of squash and a row of carrots and a shorter row for herbs, sage, and lavender and thyme. Along the fence that bordered, technically, the Underwood property, she planted sunflowers and morning glories and the honeysuckle she had gotten as a bare root cutting from Mrs. Dottie Phelps, the store owner's wife, who kept a garden of her own and was generous with her divisions. She worked in the mornings mostly because that was when he rode past. She told herself that was not the reason. She also told herself that the earth on this side of the property simply responded better to morning work, that the soil temperature was more favorable, that the dew helped the seeds settle. She was a woman who could construct a reasonable-sounding explanation for almost anything, which was a skill she had developed young and found endlessly useful. He stopped again on the third morning, while she was on her knees working compost into the bed nearest the fence. Jasper halted at the edge of the path with the polished patience of a very well-trained horse. "Honeysuckle," Abel said, looking at the bare root planting she had just firmed into place. "It'll climb the fence," she said, "in a few months. My mother used to grow it," he said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a small, unguarded thing that appeared and then was covered back over before she could look at it directly. "Along the porch." "It smells like evenings," Rose said, without thinking about it, and then felt oddly exposed, as if she had said something too personal. He looked at her for a moment with those still blue eyes. "It does," he said simply, and then he rode on. She put her hands back in the soil and breathed slowly and told herself to be sensible. By the third week of April, the garden was fully planted, and she had begun the careful daily work of watering and watching and waiting that was the true labor of growing things. She carried water in 2 large buckets from her well, which was close enough to make the task manageable, and she made a point of being out there with her buckets at the same time each morning. He always said good morning. She always said good morning back. Some days there were a few sentences exchanged. About the weather, about the progress of her plants, once about a coyote he had spotted near the eastern fence that she should be watchful for if she had chickens, which she did, and she thanked him for the warning. These were small conversations. They were also the best part of her day, and she was self-aware enough to find that fact both delightful and somewhat alarming. It was Dooley who changed things first, which was consistent with Dooley's general character. Dooley was 22 years old, with red hair and a face full of freckles, and the kind of cheerful inability to read a social situation that Rose had found exasperating and endearing in roughly equal measure since the first time she had met him in the Phelps General Store, where he had asked her whether she was the widow lady who'd taken over the Norris place, and she had informed him, with great patience, that she was neither a widow nor particularly a lady in the way he likely meant it. He had grinned at her, and she had liked him immediately and had never quite gotten rid of him. On a Saturday morning in late April, Dooley came riding up to the edge of her garden on his brown mare and leaned his forearms on the saddle horn and looked at what she had planted with an expression of genuine admiration. "Well, that's something," he said. "You know those sunflowers are going to be 5 feet tall come July." "6, if the rain cooperates," she said. "You're going to be able to see them from the house," he said, meaning Abel's house, which sat about a quarter-mile back from the fence line on a slight rise of ground. "Abel's house, I mean. He'll see them every morning." Rose kept her eyes on her watering. "I imagine he will," she said. Dooley was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that she looked up. He was wearing an expression of labored casualness that suggested he was about to say something that required effort. "Miss Norris," he said, "I have worked for Abel Underwood for 4 years, and in that time I have seen him talk to maybe 6 women voluntarily, not counting church, and you are the only one he rides past twice on his morning circuit." Rose set her bucket down. "He rides past twice." Dooley blinked, apparently realizing he had said more than he intended. He straightened up in the saddle and resettled his hat. "I didn't say anything," he said, with the conviction of a man who knows he has absolutely said something. "Dooley," she said. "I'm late to fix that north fence," he said, and turned his horse and rode at a pace that was only slightly too fast to be natural. Rose stood in her garden and looked at the fence line, and then at the path that curved east toward the Underwood ranch house, and she felt something that was warm and a little frightening and entirely wonderful unfolding in her chest, like one of her morning glories opening in the early light. She started leaving small things on the fence post at the corner of her garden. Not intentionally. She just sometimes happened to forget her pruning shears there, or a bundle of herbs she had cut and tied and left to dry, or a jar of the tomato preserves she had made from last year's late harvest tomatoes that she had put up in her uncle's old kitchen. She did not address these things to anyone. She simply left them there and went about her day, and was very determinedly not watching to see if they were picked up. The pruning shears were still there when she looked in the afternoon. The bundle of herbs was gone by the following morning. The jar of tomato preserves was gone within the same day, and 3 days later there was a folded piece of paper wedged under the jar she had retrieved, and when she opened it, there was one line written in a hand that was careful and slightly angular, and not particularly practiced at elegance but very precise. "These are the best tomatoes I have eaten in 4 years." She put the note in her leather-bound journal between 2 pages and closed the cover over it, and did not examine the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. She wrote back. She folded the note very small and left it under a stone on the fence post, which was unnecessary and felt necessary anyway. "I am glad. There are more coming in June if you would like them." He did not write back to that one, but the next morning he was on the fence path at his usual time, and when Jasper drew alongside the garden and stopped, Abel looked at the progress of the tomato plants. They were growing well, strong and green, and full of the particular ambition of plants that are genuinely happy in their soil, and he said, without quite looking at her, "I'd like them." And then he did look at her, directly. With those steady blue eyes and that quiet in his face that she had come to understand was not distance at all but was, in fact, the opposite, a kind of focused attention that he gave to things that mattered to him. "Good," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. May arrived with its long golden mornings, and its smell of new grass and the first cattle drives beginning to move through the area, which kept Abel and Clem and Dooley busy with fence checks and water sourcing, and the complicated logistics of a working ranch that Rose found herself learning in pieces from her morning conversations with Abel, who had begun stopping for slightly longer each day and who, she had noticed, was occasionally bringing 2 cups of coffee in a tin canteen from which he would pour one for himself, and then, without ceremony, produce the second cup from his saddlebag, as if he had simply forgotten he had extra coffee and was being practical. She accepted the coffee every morning. She did not comment on the pattern. She also started putting a biscuit wrapped in cloth on the fence post every morning at 6 o'clock. The biscuits were always gone by the time he rode past. She chose not to examine whether he had simply arrived earlier to pick them up before stopping at the garden, or whether it was Dooley, though she was fairly certain it was not Dooley, because Dooley would have told her with enormous and indiscreet enthusiasm. The morning in mid-May when things shifted was a Wednesday. Rose had risen early because the night had been warm and she had not slept well, and she had come out to the garden at first light to check the moisture level of the soil and to do some weeding that she had been putting off. The sky was just turning pink and gold in the east when she heard Jasper's hooves on the path, earlier than usual. Abel pulled up at the garden's edge and she looked up, and he was looking not at the garden or at the plants but directly at her, with an expression that she could not quite read, not his usual careful quiet but something more open, something that he had perhaps come to say and had not yet decided how. She waited. "Miss Norris," he said. "Mr. Underwood," she said. A pause, the sound of the early morning birds, the smell of the May grass. "There's a social at the church on Saturday," he said. "Supper and music. Mrs. Hartley has been organizing it for the past month, and I have been informed by no fewer than 3 separate people that I am expected to attend. I've heard about it, she said. She had in fact been asked by Dottie Phelps whether she planned to come, in the slightly pointed way that suggested Dottie had opinions about the matter. I wondered, Abel said, and stopped and started again. I wondered if you would want to go together. As neighbors, he added, which made something in his jaw tighten slightly, as if he had not liked that last part even as he said it. Rose looked at him for a moment. As neighbors, she repeated. Or however you'd like to call it, he said, and there was something almost raw in his voice that she did not think he had intended to let out. She let herself look at him fully then, the broad shoulders and the dark, perpetually too long hair, and the careful, attentive eyes, and the way he held himself in the saddle with that ease that comes from having grown up on horseback and spent every day of your adult life doing it. She thought about the notes and the coffee and the way he said her plants' names with the same straightforward care he gave to everything. I would like to go with you, she said. Not as neighbors. Something happened to his face that was not quite like anything she had seen on it before. It was not the small, careful smile from the morning of the stakes. It was fuller than that, a kind of opening, like a door that had been closed so long that the person inside had almost forgotten there was anything on the other side of it. All right, he said. Saturday, I'll come to your house at 5. I'll be ready at 5, she said. He nodded once, with the gravity of a man who has just made a decision that matters to him, and then he rode on. Rose turned back to her weeding and found that she was smiling so hard it was making the work difficult. The Saturday social at the Abilene First Church was everything small-town Western church socials in 1882 were, which meant folding tables covered in food that people had been cooking since Thursday, fiddle music that started promptly and went ragged by 9 o'clock, children running between the adults' legs, and a quantity of pointed social observation that Rose was accustomed to, but that she had hoped might be somewhat diminished by the fact that she was standing beside a man whose expression suggested that pointed social observation would not find particularly fertile ground. Abel arrived at her door at 5 o'clock precisely, which she had expected. He had brushed his dark hair and put on a clean shirt and his good boots, and he had brought her a small clutch of the wild prairie roses that grew along the eastern fence line of the ranch, which he held out with the brisk efficiency of a man who had decided to do something, and was going to do it regardless of whether it was easy or not. She took the flowers and found, to her considerable annoyance, that her face was doing things that she would have preferred to keep private. She put the roses in a jar of water on her kitchen table and pinned her good hat on and took the arm he offered her, and they walked the mile into town as the evening came on soft and golden around them, talking about the garden and the cattle and the upcoming dry season, and whether Phelps was going to order more flour before his supply ran out, which were not particularly romantic subjects, but which felt, on the warm evening air, with his arm solid and warm under her hand, like the most interesting conversation she had ever had. At the social, people noticed. Of course they did. Dottie Phelps noticed with the bright, satisfied expression of someone who had been waiting for this to happen, and was extremely gratified by the timing. The Reverend Caleb Marsh noticed, and said something so carefully noncommittal that it was practically a comment. Duly noticed, and could not contain a grin that stretched halfway across his freckled face, and then quickly redirected itself toward his plate of fried chicken. Even Clem Haverford, who was a taciturn man of 45 who made Abel look practically loquacious by comparison, gave Rose a single long look when she and Abel came in together, and then gave the smallest, driest nod of acknowledgment she had ever received in her life, and she somehow understood that from Clem Haverford this was equivalent to a standing ovation. There was dancing. Rose had not danced in several years, and was pleasantly surprised to find that it came back to her easily enough, the familiar steps of a Virginia reel and a simple waltz. Abel was not a graceful dancer in the way that men who have practiced at it are graceful, but he moved with the same steady, sure-footed economy he brought to everything else, and he kept his eyes on her face in a way that made the room feel considerably smaller and more private than it actually was. Between dances, they stood together near the edge of the room, and he brought her a glass of lemonade, and she asked him about his parents, his father Thomas, who had built the ranch house himself in 1861, his mother Clara, who had died when Abel was 17 and who had grown honeysuckle along the porch. She listened to him talk about his mother with a quality of attention that she hoped communicated that she understood what it meant for him to say these things at all. She would have liked the garden, he said, looking out at the room without seeing it, his voice low. She used to say that a woman who grows things understands something about the world that a woman who only buys things never does. She sounds like she was wonderful, Rose said. She was the kind of person, he said carefully, that everything made more sense around. Rose was quiet for a moment with that. Then she said, I know what you mean. My father was like that. He looked at her. Was. He died in 1878. And then my mother the following year. There were only two of us, myself and my sister in St. Louis. She kept her voice steady the way she had learned to. My uncle left me the land, and I think he left it to me because he knew I would actually use it. He was right, Abel said, with such simple directness that she felt it like warmth against her skin. They walked home under a sky full of stars, and at her porch steps he stood with his hat in his hands and said, I'd like to do this again. So would I, she said. He put his hat back on. Good night, Miss Norris. Rose, she said, please, a beat. Good night, Rose. Good night, Abel. She went inside and sat at her kitchen table next to the jar of prairie roses, and let herself feel completely and unreservedly happy for several minutes before the sensible part of her brain asked what she planned to do about this. And she answered it firmly that she planned to let it be exactly what it was and not crowd it with expectations. The honeysuckle on the fence began to bloom in the last week of May, weeks earlier than Rose had expected, perhaps because the soil on this particular strip of earth was so well suited to it, or perhaps because things in general seemed to be moving with more purpose than usual. The first white and yellow blossoms opened on a Friday morning, and the scent of them hit the warm air and spread toward both properties like something intentional. Abel was riding Jasper along the fence path when the scent reached him, and he pulled up at the garden, which he did most mornings now, but with a steadiness that had dropped all pretense of circumstance. He stood in the stirrups slightly and looked at the blooming vine along the fence, and then at Rose, who was on her knees between her tomato rows and was watching him from under the brim of her hat. Early bloomer, he said. Seems like the right time, she said. His eyes stayed on her face for a moment, and then he swung down from Jasper with the easy, automatic motion of a man who had mounted and dismounted thousands of times, and tied the horse's reins to the fence post and walked the few steps to the garden's edge. This was the first time he had left his horse and come to stand at the garden itself, and Rose got to her feet and pulled her gloves off because something about the moment seemed to require her full attention. He stood at the fence, technically his fence, given the placement of her stakes, and looked at the garden with an expression that she thought might be, underneath its usual composure, something like wonder. The tomatoes were coming up strong, nearly knee-high now and staked with the careful precision she applied to all her work. The beans were climbing their poles with a focused urgency. The sunflowers were already beginning their climb, their broad leaves spread wide, their stalks thick and determined. The herbs along the near row sent up their particular sharp, clean scents when the breeze moved through them, and along the fence, the honeysuckle bloomed and spread its sweetness over everything. You made something out here, he said. Out of nothing. The soil helped, she said. It was good soil, it just needed someone to bother with it. He looked at her. That's true of most things, he said, and she was not entirely sure they were still talking about soil. There was a moment then, one of those moments that have a particular quality of stillness to them, like the pause between lightning and thunder, when the air is charged with what is coming. Rose stood on her side of the fence and Abel stood on his, and the honeysuckle bloomed between them, and the scent of it was exactly like evenings. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have been riding past this garden on my morning circuit since the day you put the first stake in the wrong place," he said, with the air of a man making a full accounting of himself. "And then I started riding past twice, and I have been aware for some time that what I was doing was not primarily related to cattle or fences." She felt something unlatch in her chest. "I know," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was very serious and very open. "You know. I have also been aware," she said, "that I put those stakes in the wrong place entirely on purpose." A pause. Something moved through his expression, and then he laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, not loud, but real and warm and entirely unlike the careful, measured way he offered everything else. She had never heard him laugh before. She thought she would spend considerable effort getting to hear it again. "I thought," he said, recovering, "that it was possibly intentional." "I will deny it if anyone asks," she said seriously. "Of course," he said, equally seriously. He reached across the fence then, across the blooming honeysuckle, and she gave him her hand and he held it, not shaking it, just holding it, the way you hold something you have been thinking about holding for a long time and want to do properly. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm and entirely certain. "Rose," he said. "Abel," she said back. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with whatever that looks like when it means something." She looked at their joined hands over the honeysuckle fence and then up at his face. "I think," she said, "it looks like this." June came in with the full heat of the Kansas summer, and the garden exploded upward into everything it had been quietly planning to be all spring. The sunflowers hit 5 feet and then 6 and then 7. Their faces turned toward the east in the mornings, toward Abel's house, as Dooley had predicted. And they could be seen from the Underwood ranch house perfectly clearly on clear mornings, which were most mornings. The tomatoes reddened, and the beans produced heavily, and the morning glories opened and closed with the reliable drama of things that know exactly what they are and what they are for. Abel came to supper on Thursday evenings. It had started with a simple invitation from Rose, offered practically. She had more tomatoes than she could use, and he clearly was not eating as well as he should, based on evidence she had assembled from Dooley's guileless commentary, and it had become a Thursday habit within 2 weeks, as reliable as the morning rides and the coffee and the biscuits, which had not stopped. Rose was a competent and unfussy cook, who made things that were honest and good: a roasted chicken with sage from the garden, biscuits that she had long since perfected through necessity, tomato dishes in every possible configuration during the height of summer, a dried apple pie that she made from last fall's stores, and that Abel ate with the focused appreciation of a man who has been eating his own cooking for 3 years and is very aware of the difference. They talked through supper and after it, sitting on her porch as the light went out of the sky, and the fireflies appeared over the long grass, and the night air came down cool and full of the garden scents. He told her about the ranch, the work of it, the economics of it, the particular loneliness of inheriting something from a father you respected and not being entirely sure you were doing it justice. She told him about teaching school in Missouri and about her father, who had been a carpenter, and who had taught her that any job worth doing was worth understanding entirely before you started. She told him about the injustice she had witnessed in Missouri, the ways in which the land and the rights that should have protected people had been applied so unevenly, to the families displaced by economic pressures, to the freedmen who had thought the end of the war meant something more durable than it had turned out to mean, to the native peoples who had been pushed steadily back from land they had occupied for generations as settlement moved west. She spoke about it plainly, as a person who had grown up watching these things and had always found the silence around them more dishonest than naming them. Abel listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything. My father used to say this land was given to us, he said quietly, but I've never been entirely comfortable with that word given to. Things that are given to one person have generally been taken from another. Yes, she said, exactly. He looked at her in the dim evening light with something that was beyond appreciation. You think carefully about things, he said. I was a school teacher, she said. It was my job to think carefully about things. It's not everyone's job that becomes their character, he said. She felt warmth move through her at that. You think carefully too, she said. You just don't announce it. Announcing things, he said, has never seemed to me to be the point. They sat in the comfortable dark, and the fireflies moved over the grass, and eventually he stood and put his hat on and said good night with that new warmth in his voice that had been growing there since May. And she watched him walk back along the fence path toward his own house with the lantern he carried, its light moving steady and unhurried through the dark. And she thought that she had never in her life felt so much like herself as she did in these evenings. In late June, there was trouble. It came in the form of a man named Harlan Weeks, who was a land agent operating out of Wichita and who had been buying up parcels across the valley with a combination of financial pressure and legal maneuvering that the smaller landowners found extremely difficult to resist. He arrived in Abilene on a Tuesday afternoon driving a black buggy with a matched pair of horses and carrying a leather case full of papers, and he went directly to see Rose. She was in the garden when he arrived, and he stood at the edge of her property, the original edge, 12 feet further west than her stakes, and called out to her in the polished, pleasant voice of a man who has learned to deliver bad news pleasantly. "Miss Norris," he said. "Harlan Weeks, Weeks Land and Property out of Wichita. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." She took off her gloves and came to meet him, and she listened while he laid out, with great cordiality, the proposition that her 22 acres, which were pleasant but not particularly productive, and which a single woman working alone would find increasingly difficult to maintain, might be worth a sum of money that he was prepared to offer her today, this very afternoon, which would allow her to relocate somewhere more comfortable and leave this hard country to those better equipped for it. Rose looked at him with a quality of patience that could have been mistaken for interest, but was actually something considerably colder. "Mr. Weeks," she said when he had finished, "I appreciate you coming out. I'm going to need you to leave now." His pleasantness dimmed slightly. "Miss Norris, I'd encourage you to consider the offer carefully. Land values in this area are unlikely to—" "Mr. Weeks," she said again with perfect composure, "this land was left to me by my uncle, and I intend to work it and keep it for as long as I choose. I will not be selling it to you or to anyone else. Good afternoon." He looked at her for a long moment with the assessing eyes of a man who has learned which people will eventually be worn down and which ones will not. Then he tipped his hat with diminished warmth and drove his black buggy back toward town. Rose stood watching him go and felt something that was not fear, exactly, but that was alert enough that she paid attention to it. She told Abel about Weeks at supper that Thursday, matter-of-factly, not as someone asking for help, but as someone informing a person she trusted about a situation that deserved to be known. Abel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he put down his fork and was quiet for a moment. "Weeks has been at 2 other properties in the valley," he said, "the Hartley Farm and the Sorin Place. Sorin held out, but Mrs. Hartley sold in April." "I know," Rose said. "I spoke to Mrs. Hartley at the social." "He'll come back," Abel said. "Men like that always come back when the first answer is no." "I know that too," she said. "Your deed is in order?" he asked, not because he doubted it, but because he was the kind of man who checked. "It is, properly filed with the county recorder." He nodded once. "If he gives you any further trouble," he said, "I'd like to know." "I'm not asking you to fight my battles," she said, with a directness that she hoped communicated that she meant it. "I know you're not," he said, with an equal directness that communicated he meant what he was offering. "I'm offering to stand beside you in one. There's a difference." She looked at him across the table with the tomato candles she had made the previous winter because she had not gotten around to buying proper ones, and she thought that there was, in fact, quite a considerable difference, and that the difference was the exact shape of Abel Underwood. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you." Weeks did come back in mid-July, with papers that suggested, in language that was technically legal but deliberately obscured, that there might be some question about the original property line of the Gerald Norris parcel, a question that he implied could be resolved to mutual satisfaction if certain arrangements were made promptly. Rose read the papers and recognized them for what they were, a pressure tactic, designed to make her uncertain enough to sell quickly. She was not uncertain. She was also not going to handle this alone. She went to Abel. Not to his morning ride, she went to the ranch house, walked the quarter-mile across the dry summer grass and knocked on his door at 8 o'clock in the morning. And when he opened the door, she showed him the papers and said, "I think he's made a mistake involving the fence line." Abel read the papers. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but she had come to read the smaller indicators, the slight tension in his jaw, the quality of stillness that deepened when something required his full attention. "He's citing the property survey from 1867, he said. "That survey was superseded by the 1874 county resurvey. I know because the 1874 survey is how my own property line was corrected." "You have the documentation?" she asked. "I do," he said, "somewhere in my father's papers. Give me an hour." He found it in 45 minutes. They took both documents, the 1874 county resurvey and the original Norris deed, to the county recorder's office in Abilene, where a pale, careful man named Mr. Elias Turnbull examined them and confirmed, with no particular drama, that the Norris property line was exactly as described in the deed, and that any suggestion otherwise was without foundation. They sent a copy of Mr. Turnbull's written confirmation to Harlan Weeks by post, and Rose never heard from him again. Standing outside the county recorder's office in the afternoon heat, Rose straightened her hat and looked at Abel. "Thank you," she said. "Your land was already clear," he said. "You just needed someone to say so officially. You knew where to find the documentation," she said. "That was the part I couldn't have done alone." He looked at her steadily. "You would have found it, given time." "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't have to because you already knew." She paused. "I'm grateful." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad I could be useful to you." It was such an understated way of saying something she suspected went rather deeper than usefulness, and she found it entirely characteristic of him and entirely endearing, and she said, "Abel." "Yes," he said. "I am not only grateful," she said, in case that was in any question. His eyes did that thing she had come to love, that complete focused stillness that meant she had all of his attention. "It wasn't," he said, "in any question." They walked back through the town together in the July heat, past the store and the livery and the church and the saloon with its sound of midday argument. And it seemed to Rose that the town looked different to her than it had when she arrived 14 months ago. Not smaller, but more real, more hers, more like the place where things were going to happen to her that were worth having happen. August brought the peak of the garden's production and the deepest heat of the summer, and Rose spent her mornings in the cool hours before 7 picking tomatoes and beans and squash, and carrying them into the house, and then in the evenings returning to water what the sun had stressed during the day. The sunflowers stood in their long row against the fence, their wide yellow faces turned according to the light's direction, visible from the Underwood ranch house with perfect clarity. Abel had told her on a Thursday evening that he could see them from his bedroom window in the mornings. She had said, with composure she was proud of, that she was glad they were tall enough to be visible. He had said that he looked for them first thing each morning, before he did anything else, and that this had somewhat reorganized his sense of what the morning was for. She had not been able to find composure for that one, and had simply been quiet for a moment in a way that she suspected communicated everything she would have said if she could have. Duly, who was as delighted by the development as a person could be without being insufferable about it, had taken to greeting Rose at the garden most mornings when he came down the fence line to check water levels in the creek, which did not actually require him to pass the garden at all, given where the creek was, with updates that he delivered with an air of complete innocence. Abel whistled this morning, he said on a Tuesday in August, leaning on the fence post with his hat tipped back. First time in 4 years, I swear. Is that right? Rose said deadpan, deadheading one of the spent sunflower stalks. He also made enough coffee for 2 people and then looked at it like he'd forgotten himself, Dooley said. And then he drank both cups, which isn't like him either. Dooley, Rose said. Yes, Miss Norris. Go check the water levels. Yes, Miss Norris, he said, grinning, and pushed off the fence and went. She allowed herself a private smile that she kept entirely between herself and the sunflowers. At the end of August, Abel asked her to come and see the ranch house. He asked it in the same direct, considered way he asked everything, over coffee on a morning when the heat had finally broken and the air smelled like the beginning of autumn's edge. I'd like to show you the place, he said. The house and the land, if you want to see it. I'd like that, she said. He took her on a Sunday afternoon, coming to her door with Jasper, and with a second horse he had borrowed from Clem, a steady chestnut mare named Fern, and they rode the 1/4 mile to the ranch house together in the golden afternoon light that September in Kansas produced with such casual magnificence. The Underwood ranch house was larger than she had realized from her property. A solid 2-story structure of weathered pine with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side, built in 1861 by Thomas Underwood, with the care of a man who intended what he was building to last. The porch had a porch swing, and there was a space along the front railing where honeysuckle had grown once. She could see the marks where it had been trained to climb, and where the wood was slightly more weathered from years of the vine's shade. Abel showed her the house without comment but with care. The kitchen, which was functional and scrupulously clean in the way that things are clean when a single person who is particular about order has been the only one maintaining them. The front room with its stone fireplace and its 2 good chairs and its shelves of practical books, a farming almanac, a Bible, a volume on cattle breeding, and then, slightly unexpectedly, a collection of Shakespeare that she recognized as having been well read from the worn spine. The room upstairs where his mother's quilts were still folded on the chest at the end of the bed, clean and preserved. He showed her the land, the eastern fields where the cattle grazed and the fence lines that Clem and Dooley maintained, the windmill that pumped water to the eastern trough, the barn where Jasper and Fern lived, and where the smell of hay and leather and horses was as comfortable and honest as anything she had encountered. He showed her the rise of ground behind the house where you could see for miles in every direction, the town to the west and her own house and garden to the south, bright in the afternoon light. They stood on that rise of ground for a while in the warm September air, looking out. Your garden, he said, pointing, and she could see it clearly from here, the rows and the fence and the tall brown stalks of the spent sunflowers that she had not yet cleared, holding their dry faces up in the late light. You really can see it from here, she said. I told you, he said. She looked at the garden from this distance and saw it the way he saw it every morning, and something about that perspective, the way it looked from his place, small and intentional and alive in the middle of the dry land, moved her in a way she hadn't expected. She had built it as something between a declaration and a question, and from here she could see that it had always been both. Abel, she said. Yes, he said. He was already looking at her. I love you, she said, simply, without preamble, because she had been carrying it long enough, and because the moment was one of those moments that called for directness, and she had never been afraid of directness even when it cost her something. He was very still for a moment. The September wind moved through the grass around them, and the light lay long and golden over the land. Rose, he said, and his voice was not steady, which was the first time she had heard it be anything other than steady, and it went directly to her heart. He turned to face her fully, and there was nothing guarded or measured in his expression at all. "I have loved you since the morning with the stakes," he said. "I just needed time to believe it was something I was allowed to have." She looked at him with a fullness of feeling that she did not try to contain. "You are," she said, "allowed." He reached out and took her face in his hands carefully. With that particular care, he gave to things that mattered and kissed her in the September light on the rise of ground above the ranch. And it was nothing like an accident, and everything like something that had been growing toward this moment since the first warm morning of spring. They were engaged by October. Abel asked her one Thursday evening on her porch. With the same serious directness he brought to everything important, got down on one knee on the porch board she had replaced herself in her first autumn, with a ring that had been his mother's, and that he had kept in the cigar box in his father's desk for 3 years, wondering if there would ever be a person who was the right person for it, and said, "Rose Norris, will you marry me and build a life here with me? I cannot promise you easy, but I can promise you true." She did not hesitate. She had not hesitated about anything involving Abel since April. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she threw her arms around him with a degree of enthusiasm that surprised them both and made him laugh again. That real, warm sound that she had been collecting all summer. And they stood on the porch in the October dusk with the smell of the season changing and the garden putting itself to bed for the year. And she thought that she had never in her life been so sure of anything. The wedding was in November, in the Abilene First Church, on a Saturday morning when the prairie had turned all its autumn gold, and the sky was that particular sharp blue that came with the first cold of the season. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with his usual careful gravity. Dottie Phelps wept and took credit for the match in the way that people who are partly responsible for a thing do when they are generous of spirit and not entirely wrong. Dooley cried very briefly, and then denied it with great energy. Clem Haverford, standing next to Dooley as the only representative of Abel's household, wore an expression of complete and dignified satisfaction. Rose wore her best dress, which was a deep green that her sister Clara had sent from St. Louis when Rose had written to tell her the news, arriving just in time and accompanied by a letter of such overwhelming joy and barely controlled relief that Rose had read it 3 times, and then replied that she was very well and that Clara should please visit in the spring. Clara had written back that she absolutely would, and had asked for 17 specific details about Abel, which Rose had provided with considerably more warmth than she usually gave to detailed descriptions of anything. Abel stood at the front of the church in his good shirt and his brushed-off hat and his clean boots, and he watched Rose come down the short aisle with the focus of a man who is making absolutely certain he does not miss a single moment of the thing he has waited the longest for. And when she reached him and took his hand, he said, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "There you are." She had to blink against the sudden sharp feeling in her eyes. "Here I am," she said. They said their vows with the plainness and weight of people who mean every word, and the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, and Abel kissed her in front of the entire congregation of the Abilene First Church with a thoroughness that made Dottie Phelps applaud and made Dooley whoop until Clem put a hand on his shoulder. They lived in the Underwood ranch house, as was practical. It was larger and more established, and Abel's operation depended on his proximity to the land, but Rose kept her own house with its 22 acres, which she continued to tend, and which she rented for a small annual sum to the Sorin family when they needed additional grazing for their milk cows. The arrangement worked cleanly and honestly, and Rose was satisfied with it. She planted honeysuckle along the front porch of the ranch house that first spring, bare root divisions from the ones she had cultivated so successfully on the fence. She trained them up the porch posts with the same steady patience she brought to all her growing things, and by June they had found their purchase and begun their climb, and by July the porch smelled in the evenings like evenings, exactly as Abel's mother had intended it to. Abel watched the honeysuckle climb from his chair on the porch swing, and one evening he reached over and took her hand without saying anything, and she understood everything he meant by it. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was a quiet one, in the best possible sense. They settled into the rhythms of the ranch and the household with the ease of two people who had been, without knowing it, preparing for exactly this arrangement for all the years before it. Rose took over the kitchen with an efficiency that Abel found deeply reassuring and occasionally alarming. She reorganized his father's filing system into something logical and began keeping the ranch accounts in the same ledger book she had learned accounting in as a school teacher, which resulted in a clarity of financial record that Clem, reviewing it for the first time in February, acknowledged with a look of undisguised respect. She got along with Clem Haverford better than she had expected, which surprised her until she realized that what Clem respected was competence applied without fanfare, and that she had a sufficient quantity of both to satisfy even his demanding standards. She established quickly and without drama that she was not a woman who required management, and Clem absorbed this information and adjusted accordingly, and they developed a working relationship of mutual, taciturn regard that suited them both perfectly. Dooley remained incorrigibly delighted by everything and continued to be the source of most of what passed for levity on the Underwood ranch, which was a role Rose had come to feel the ranch genuinely needed and that she encouraged without making a point of it. In March of 1883, Rose discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Abel on a Saturday morning before breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea she had not yet drunk. He was at the stove and she said his name, and he turned and looked at her, and something in her face told him before she found the words, and he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and sat down across from her and took both her hands in both of his. She told him. He looked at her with those still blue eyes, and there was so much in them relief and joy and something very serious that she understood was love taking responsibility for itself, that she felt her own eyes fill. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I'm very well," she said. I wanted to tell you before I thought about it too much and got sensible about it." He laughed, that warm, real sound, and brought her hands up and pressed his lips to them. "Don't be sensible about it," he said. "Not today." They sat in the March morning with the New Year's light coming through the kitchen window and the honeysuckle just beginning to bud again on the porch, and it was one of those mornings that feel like the answer to a question you did not know you were asking. They named him Thomas, after Abel's father, which felt right in the way that the name settled into the house as if it had always been there waiting. Thomas Underwood was born in November of 1883, a healthy, demanding, dark-haired boy who had his father's blue eyes and his mother's sharp attention, and who from his first weeks on earth gave the impression of a person who was taking detailed notes on everything and would have opinions about it shortly. Abel, holding his son for the first time, stood in the bedroom with the late November light on his face and was quieter than usual, which was saying something. Rose watched him from the bed with the warmth and exhaustion of the recently delivered, and thought that she had never loved anyone quite the way she loved Abel Underwood, and that she had apparently been wrong about the ceiling of the thing, because she loved him considerably more than she had the moment before Thomas arrived. Dooley, informed of the birth and the name, said, "Thomas," very seriously, and then said, "I'm going to teach him to ride before he can walk," and Clem told him flatly that he was not, and they argued about it in the yard in a way that suggested Thomas would grow up with more aunts and uncles than anyone without siblings had a right to expect. Clara came from St. Louis in the spring of 1884, finally making good on her promise. She arrived on the train at the Abilene station with 3 trunks of luggage and a quantity of enthusiasm, and an immediate, obvious approval of Abel that she expressed through the medium of asking him an extremely large number of questions over supper on the first evening, all of which he answered with patience and without discomfort, which Rose observed and loved him for. Clara stayed 6 weeks, which was longer than she had planned and shorter than she wanted. She helped with Thomas and worked alongside Rose in the garden, which had been re-established along the fence line for its third season, and had grown more elaborate with each year. Rose had added strawberries along the south wall and had begun a small apple tree nursery along the western edge. 5 small trees that would not produce for years, but that she had put in with the long patience of a person who thinks in seasons and decades. "You built all of this," Clara said one afternoon, standing in the middle of the garden with a handful of strawberries she had been tasting as she went. "Abel and I did," Rose said. Clara looked at her with the particular expression of a sister who has known you your whole life and has seen you through everything and is looking at you now and seeing you happy. "You look like you're exactly where you're supposed to be," she said. Rose looked at the garden and then at the ranch house beyond it and at the land in all directions, familiar now in every season and in every kind of light. "I am," she said simply. Clara went back to St. Louis in June, promising to return the following spring with her husband and her own 2 children, which she did, and which proved to be an extremely lively several weeks that Thomas weathered with the adaptable good humor he had apparently decided early on was his nature. The garden became a fixture of the Underwood property in the way that things become fixtures when they are both beautiful and useful. The neighbors knew about it. The women of the church auxiliary asked Rose for advice on their own kitchen gardens. Phelps began stocking the particular variety of tomato seed Rose preferred, because enough people had asked him about it. The honeysuckle on the fence bloomed each June with extravagant reliability, and in the evenings when the air was still, the scent of it came through the porch where Rose and Abel sat after Thomas was in bed, which was where they did most of their best talking. They talked about everything. They talked about the ranch and its finances and the practical questions of what to plant and what to graze and whether to expand the herd, about which Abel always made the final decision, but never without first hearing Rose's thoughts, which she offered clearly and which he weighed seriously. They talked about Thomas and about what they wanted for him, and what he was already showing signs of being, which was, at 2 years old, clearly a person of significant opinions. They talked about the world beyond Abilene, about the news that came through the papers and through travelers, about the continuing displacement of the native peoples and the unresolved questions of Reconstruction, and about all the large, uncomfortable shapes of what was happening to the country and what it meant. They talked sometimes about the garden. "You know," Abel said one June evening, with the honeysuckle in full flood and Thomas asleep upstairs and the fireflies beginning their evening rise over the long grass, "when I first rode past and saw those stakes, I knew within 3 days that you'd put them there on purpose." Rose kept her expression perfectly composed. "What made you think so?" "Because you had measured everything else to the inch," he said. "Your fence line on the west side was exact. Your rows were exact. You are not a woman who miscounts paces." "That's a very unflattering observation," she said. "It was the best thing I'd ever seen," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with that particular focused stillness, full attention, fully given. "I was afraid," she said, "that it was too obvious, that it would make me seem foolish." "It made you seem," he said, "like someone who wanted something enough to do something ridiculous to get it, which I found very encouraging, because I wanted the same thing and had no idea what to do about it." She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with that certainty that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. "I'm glad I was ridiculous," she said. "So am I," he said. In the winter of 1885, Rose became pregnant again. This time she told Abel in the evening, over supper, and he pushed his chair back and came around the table and kissed the top of her head and then sat back down and finished his supper with the expression of a man who is very happy and very hungry simultaneously, which she found completely characteristic and entirely dear. Their second child was a girl. She arrived in August of 1885 on a hot afternoon that was entirely typical of Kansas August afternoons, and they named her Clara, for Rose's sister, who was informed of this by letter and wrote back 3 pages of pure joy with very few complete sentences. Clara Underwood had her mother's auburn hair and her father's composed and watchful quality, and within the first month she had clearly decided that Thomas was the most interesting thing in the world, a judgment she never substantially revised. Thomas, who was nearly 2 years old and had developed very strong feelings about most things, received his sister with an expression of deep seriousness, and then, apparently deciding she met some criterion he had been applying, placed his hand very gently on top of her head in what Rose interpreted as a gesture of acceptance. Abel, watching this from across the room, reached over and squeezed Rose's hand without looking away from the children. Life on the Underwood ranch settled into the kind of fullness that is hard to describe without sounding simpler than it is. The daily work of the land and the livestock, the changing of the seasons which were never boring and never easy, the growth of the children who were distinct and interesting and surprising on a consistent basis, the Thursday evenings that had never stopped being the best part of the week, which were now more complicated and louder and better than they had ever been. Clem Haverford, who had turned 50 in 1884, began to slow in the ways that men who have worked physically hard their whole lives begin to slow, and Abel managed this with the same careful attention he gave to everything that mattered, finding ways to keep Clem useful and valued without asking more of him than was decent. Clem, who had been with the Underwood family for longer than Abel could entirely remember, stayed on the ranch with the dignity of a man who knows he is where he belongs, and he took to Thomas and Clara with a slow, gruff warmth that Rose found entirely moving. Dooley, true to his promise and despite Clem's protestations, had Thomas in the saddle for the first time at age 3, on a very small and extremely patient pony that Abel had traded for specifically for this purpose, and that Dooley had been training with characteristic enthusiasm. Thomas proved to have his father's ease on horseback, taking to it with an immediate natural confidence that made Abel's face do something quiet and proud. Rose kept the garden. Every spring she planned it, and every spring she planted it, and every summer she tended it, expanding and adjusting and improving, adding new things when she found seed packets that interested her, and removing what had not worked without sentiment. The apple trees along the western edge grew slowly and surely, the way apple trees do, and by 1887, the 3 that had survived out of the 5 original were tall enough to provide genuine shade and beginning to set small, experimental fruit that was not yet good for eating, but that was very much a fruit, and that made Rose unreasonably happy every time she looked at it. The sunflowers along the fence bloomed every summer. She replanted them every spring from saved seed, selecting for height and for the particular deep gold color she preferred, and by 1887 she had a strain of sunflower that was reliably 7 feet tall and that produced heads the size of dinner plates, and she was obscurely proud of this in a way that she understood was not entirely about the sunflowers. One morning in the summer of 1887, when Thomas was nearly 4 and Clara not quite 2, Abel came in from the morning circuit to find Rose in the kitchen making bread, which she did on Tuesdays with the same reliable precision she had once applied to her school lessons, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her before she noticed him. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression that she had come to know the way she knew every angle of the light on the property at every time of day, that full, attentive, completely given focus that meant he was thinking about something important. "What?" she said. "I was just thinking," he said, "that I see you in this kitchen and I see you in the garden and I see you with the children and I see you at the church and at the store and in every ordinary place, and every single time I see you it's the same." "The same as what?" she asked. "The same as the first time," he said, "like I'm still figuring out that you're real." She set down her bread dough and wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him. And he held her with both arms around her, solid and certain, and they stood in the summer kitchen while the bread waited, and Thomas ran in the yard outside calling something to Dooley, and Clara's laughter came from the porch where she had been set down with a collection of wooden animals Abel had carved for her through the winter. "Abel," she said into his shirt. "Yes," he said. "I would put those stakes in the wrong place 100 more times," she said. She felt the rumble of his laugh against her. "I know," he said, "so would I." The years that followed were the years of building, not building from nothing, as those first years had been, but building into something, adding depth to what was already solid. By 1890, Thomas was in school on Wednesdays at the church building, and he took to it with the focused engagement of a child who has been read to since before he could speak, and who has had the great good fortune of a mother who understood that learning was not a burden but a privilege. Clara followed him 2 years later with her mother's systematic curiosity and her father's patient observation, and between the two of them, the Underwood children were a significant presence in the Abilene schoolhouse. Rose became, without quite planning to, one of the people whom other women in the area consulted on practical matters, gardening of course, but also the management of household accounts and the small medical knowledge she had assembled from a doctor's book she had ordered from a catalog in 1883, and which she had read so thoroughly that several pages had loosened from the binding. She was not a doctor, obviously, and she was careful to say so. But she knew the difference between a fever that would break and one that would not, and she knew which herbs from her garden helped which complaints, and she knew when to send for Dr. Fulton, who rode out from the county seat once a month, and who relied on Rose's preliminary assessments with a trust that he acknowledged plainly. Abel watched all of this with the same quiet pride with which he watched the ranch grow, and the children grow, and the apple trees, slowly, grow. He was not a man who said a great deal about what he felt, but he showed it in the consistent, daily, particular ways that she had learned to read as fluently as she read words on a page. The coffee brought in the morning, he still did this, never stopped. The small domestic ritual had simply moved from a tin canteen on a fence to a proper cup on their kitchen table. The way he noticed things without being asked to, the board on the porch that needed replacing before she mentioned it, the well rope that frayed before she realized it, the way he held her hand. He held her hand all the time. In church, walking to the store, sitting on the porch in the evenings. It was not a habit he had developed consciously. It was simply what his hand did when she was near, the way a plant finds the light. In October of 1891, Clara asked to help with the garden. She was 6 years old and had her mother's insistence on doing things properly and her father's patience with slow processes, and Rose gave her a small portion of the bed nearest the house and a packet of radish seeds, something fast, something concrete, something that would show results before a 6-year-old's patience gave out and set her loose. Clara's radishes were magnificent. She checked them every morning with the focused attention of a scientist, reporting each day on their progress to her father over breakfast, who listened to each report with the same gravity with which he listened to Clem's fence reports, and who, when the first radish was pulled from the earth and presented to him for inspection, held it and turned it in his hand, and said that it was the best radish he had seen in some time, which made Clara incandescent with satisfaction. Thomas, who at 8 had decided that farming was interesting but not as interesting as cattle, had nevertheless been persuaded by his mother to take responsibility for the watering on days when she was occupied elsewhere, which he did with the conscientious reliability that had been the core of his character since infancy. He became, over the following years, the kind of young man who understood that the thing you have been given responsibility for reflects on your character, which was something both his parents had taught him in different ways. His father through the example of the ranch, his mother through the example of the garden. The apple trees produced their first real harvest in the autumn of 1892. Rose picked the apples with Clara helping, and Thomas being conscripted for the higher branches, and she made apple butter and dried apple rings and a proper apple pie that was the best dessert she had produced in 10 years, which, given her history with dried apple pies, was saying something considerable. Abel ate 2 slices of the apple pie and then looked across the table at her and said, with great seriousness, "You planned this when you planted those trees." "I planted those trees in 1883, she said. "You planned the apple pie in 1883, he said. "I planned the apple trees in 1883, she said. The pie was the natural consequence. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was fond and amused and admiring all at once, which was the expression that had the most of everything in it and that she had never quite gotten used to seeing directed at her. "Rose," he said. "Abel," she said back. "You are the most patient person I have ever known," he said. She thought about the stakes in April of 1882. She thought about the garden on the edge of his property, the deliberate miscounting of paces, the morning glories and the honeysuckle, and the sunflowers visible from his bedroom window. She thought about all the patient, deliberate, carefully not accidental things she had done in the spring of that year. "I can be patient," she said, "when I'm working towards something worth waiting for." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand, and his fingers closed around hers as they always did, with that certainty that had never lessened. The children were arguing about something on the other side of the room, with the vigorous, entirely non-violent disagreement of siblings who fundamentally like each other and have strong opinions. The kitchen smelled like apples and wood smoke, and the last of the season's herbs drying over the stove. Outside, the garden was putting itself to rest for the winter in the way it did each year, the spent stalks cleared, the beds mulched with straw, the apple trees bare-limbed against the October sky. The fence where the honeysuckle climbed was bare too, the vine gone brown and quiet, saving itself as it always did for spring. But the roots were there. All of it, the roots of the honeysuckle and the strawberries and the apple trees and the deep-worked soil of 10 years of tending, all of it was there, underground, patient, absolutely certain. Spring would come. It always came. Rose knew this the way she knew every growing thing from the ground up, from the roots, from the small, deliberate beginning of something that has decided what it intends to be and has the patience to become it. She looked at her husband and her children and her kitchen and out through the window at her garden, resting in the October light, and she thought, here, here and here and here and here, all of it, every bit of it exactly as she had intended, even the part she had pretended was an accident. Especially that part. Thomas grew into a young man of 18 by the turn of the decade, serious and competent, and full of a kind of contained energy that Abel recognized from the inside. He had taken to the ranch work with a seriousness that matched his grandfather's name, learning everything Clem had left behind when Clem passed quietly in the winter of 1894, at age 60, in the room above the barn where he had slept for 11 years. Abel had taken Clem's passing with the measured grief of a man who had known it was coming, and had said what needed to be said before it arrived. And Rose had sat with him on the porch the night after Clem died, and they had talked about the man, his history and his character, and the particular honor of someone who showed up without fail to the same work for 40 years. And it had been the kind of talking that made grief bearable because it was honest. Thomas had liked Clem in the way that young people like the old people who treat them seriously, and he mourned him genuinely, and then, as Clem would have found entirely appropriate, went back to work. Dooley, now in his 30s and considerably more weathered but not substantially less cheerful, had stayed on the Underwood ranch through everything, and had become, over the years, as close to family as a person who is not family can become. He had married a woman named Iris Gallagher in 1889, a spirited woman with a quick laugh who ran the seamstress business out of the rooms above Phelps's store, and they had settled in town and had 3 children of their own, and Dooley commuted to the ranch each day on his brown mare, who had been replaced by a brown mare's brown offspring, who had then been replaced by that offspring's bay son, so that there had been, for the entire 17 years of Rose and Abel's marriage, always a horse of Dooley's at the Underwood ranch, which felt to Rose like a form of continuity she was grateful for. Clara, at 14, was already demonstrating that she intended to be someone specific. She had her mother's systematic mind and had taken her schooling with a seriousness that the Wednesday schoolteacher, a patient young man named Mr. Fuller who had come from Iowa, described as remarkable. She wanted, she told her parents with great clarity, to go to one of the women's colleges back east. Rose heard this with a complicated feeling that she examined carefully and concluded was primarily pride with a secondary layer of wondering at the distance and a small, honest note of recognition. Of course she did. Of course, this daughter of hers wanted the thing that would let her go further than the circumstances of her birth had initially suggested. Abel listened to Clara's announcement with his usual focused seriousness and asked several practical questions about which colleges, what cost, what preparation was required, and then said he would look into it, which meant he would do exactly what he said. Rose, watching him, understood once again that she had married the right man and that she had known it since April of 1882. The summer of 1897 was the 15th year of the garden on the edge of Abel Underwood's property, which was no longer technically the edge of his property, because Rose's 22 acres had been, for reasons of practical management, incorporated into the Underwood deed in 1888, which meant that the garden was now unambiguously on Underwood land and had been for 9 years. Rose found this entirely satisfying and slightly funny, and had noted it in her journal with a brief comment about the nature of property lines and their various interpretations. The garden was magnificent that summer. 15 years of careful soil improvement, the composting and the cover crops and the particular attention she had given to understanding what the earth in this corner of the valley needed, had produced a plot that grew things with an extravagance that people came to see. The apple trees were mature and heavy with fruit. The honeysuckle on the fence had grown so established that it had to be cut back significantly each spring, or it would engulf the fence entirely, which Rose managed with a firm hand and a certain respect for its ambition. The sunflowers, her annual sunflowers from her saved and selected seed, were reliably magnificent. On a morning in July of that 15th summer, Rose was in the garden before the heat of the day built, doing the weeding between the bean rows that she still did herself, because she had never found a satisfactory way to delegate it that met her standards. She was 50 years old that year, and she felt it in her knees in a way she did not feel it anywhere else, and she had a folded piece of canvas she put down to kneel on, which she had resisted for 2 years before conceding that it made the work better and not admitting this to anyone. She heard Jasper's hooves on the path. This was still the path Abel rode in the mornings, though Jasper was 23 years old and moved with considerable more deliberation than he once had. There had been some suggestion from Thomas that perhaps Jasper should be retired to the field and Abel should ride the younger sorrel, and Abel had listened to this suggestion politely and continued to ride Jasper. The old gray horse stopped at the garden's edge. Abel swung down from the saddle, still with ease, though she noticed the care he now took in the way he did not notice himself taking it, and tied Jasper to the fence post and came and stood at the edge of the garden. She looked up at him. 51 years old, with more gray in his dark hair than dark, with the lines of 30 years of working in the sun mapped clearly on his face, with those eyes that were exactly the same as they had always been, still and blue and entirely, completely attentive. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He was looking at the garden with an expression she knew, that one that had appeared the first time he had come to stand at the garden's edge rather than passing by, that quality of something that was not quite wonder but was in its neighborhood. "It's good this year," she said. "It's always good," he said. "But this year it's better." She looked at the garden, the beans and the tomatoes and the squash and the herbs and the apple trees heavy in the corner, and the honeysuckle rioting on the fence and the tall gold sunflowers just beginning to open their enormous faces to the morning. And she thought that he was right. It was better this year. Every year it was better than it had been, because she knew it better and she had given it more and the soil had deepened and the roots had gone down further. "Come here," she said. He stepped over the low border of the garden bed and came to where she was kneeling and crouched down beside her. This man of 51 years who was still careful and still certain and still the most solid thing she had ever known. And she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning garden, in the smell of the earth and the honeysuckle and the July warmth and the whole accumulated presence of 15 years. "Abel," she said. "Yes," he said, as he always said, as he had always said. "I love this," she said. "Not just you, though, yes, always you, but this, the whole of it. The land and the garden and the children and the mornings and the work and the Thursday evenings and the coffee and the sound of Jasper on the path and this." He knew what she meant. He had always known what she meant. That was one of the great gifts of 15 years, the ability to mean the whole of something and have it understood in full. "So do I," he said. The morning glories on the fence began to open, one by one. In the rising light, those blue and purple and white blooms that opened in the early hours and closed by noon, and then opened again the following morning, reliable and deliberate and cyclical as everything that lives and grows. Rose watched them open from the circle of Abel's arm and thought about all the springs and all the mornings and all the deliberate things that had been pretending, just barely, to be accidents. She had built a garden on the edge of his property and pretended it was an accident, and the cowboy had smiled. And here, 15 years and 2 children and 10,000 mornings later, they were still here, rooted and growing and full of the particular deep life of things that have been well tended, that have had the good fortune to find the right soil and stay in it, that have sent their roots down so far into the good dark earth that no drought and no hard winter and no Harlan weeks with a leather case full of papers could move them. The garden breathed in the July morning. The honeysuckle reached and climbed. The sunflowers opened their enormous faces and turned toward the light. And Abel Underwood held his wife among her growing things, and it was morning, and the day was beginning, and everything, every single thing was exactly where it was supposed to be.